Welcome to the Alex Jones Show on this Friday, December 27th, 2013. I'm David Knight filling in for Alex. Although Alex is going to be joining us in the second hour, he's going to be breaking down a lot of important news that's coming out, a wide range of news. We've also got some other interesting things that happened just the last couple of days. On December the 23rd, on Monday, we posted a video about the Federal Reserve, actually comparing it to It's a Wonderful Life. Now, in spite of the fact that the entire movie is up on YouTube and that it's been up there for nearly 2 years come February, and that it's had over 700,000 views of the entire film, our film was singled out and shut down for quote-unquote copyright reasons. Even though the entire film is up there and has been there for 2 years, it was shut down. And the interesting thing about it is that as people echoed and mirrored that report on YouTube, and as we linked to it on our page on InfoWars, as we linked on that report page talking about the video itself, the videos that we would link to would be taken down, but only those videos. So it's not something that's happening with a bot. And of course, what we did was fair use anyway, but they have the entire movie up there and have left it up there for 2 years. What we did was a report that was essentially a commentary on the similarities between what the banker Potter did and what the Federal Reserve did, essentially similarities between J.P. Morgan and other issues, other commentaries about the movie. And most of it was covered with a voiceover. There were pictures that were taken out selectively. That is all fair use. That's political commentary. But again, understand that the entire movie is up and only the videos that we link to from InfoWars are being taken down. So we're going to have that report later on. At the bottom of the hour, we're going to break that down for you in a little bit more detail. We're also going to air the entire video for you. So if you're watching this on the website or on Prison Planet TV broadcast, you can see the entire report. And we have the report up on Prison Planet TV for those of you who are subscribers. Now, we're also going to be talking in this program, we're going to have William Binney, the highest-ranking NSA whistleblower ever. Now, he was the technical director of the geopolitical world, as they call it. It is essentially the rank of a general in the NSA. And after the September 11th attacks, he came out and basically blew the whistle on what the NSA was doing. They changed their approach at that time, he believed. Now we know that it was earlier than that. They were also doing this, but he came out protesting what he learned at that time, that they were doing a full surveillance of everything, a dragnet surveillance, if you will. Of course, he said later on, he said they don't need a dragnet because they're getting every fish in the sea already. And so he came out and protested that along with several other NSA high-ranking officials, although he was the highest. He's going to be joining us to talk about that. You know, about a year ago, he said we're this close to a police state, held his two fingers just a little bit apart. And just recently, he came out and said, we do have a police state. So we're going to have him break that down for us. He was a cryptographer, so we're going to talk to him about some of those issues as well. We want to get his take on what he thinks needs to happen to roll this back, to get the NSA under control. This is somebody who worked there for 30 years and knows it from the inside out. So stay tuned. That's going to be a really important interview. Now, it's the end of the year, so of course the government has their wish list. And what is always at the top of the government's wish list under Obama? It's gun control. Yes, gun control and new taxes. That's what they're looking at for you for the new year. They're eagerly anticipating getting rid of ammunition and also registering a lot more guns in a lot of other places like Connecticut. We've got people lining up in Connecticut to buy guns before new laws go into effect. So the EPA is also coming out and coming after ammunition. And we're going to have that story right after the break. It's one of these things where, isn't ammunition part of the right to keep and bear arms? Is it just having an empty rifle? Is that what the Second Amendment about? No, it's not. It's about arms. It's about having bullets as well as guns. Stay tuned. We're going to talk about that right after the break. We're also going to be joined by the highest-ranking NSA whistleblower ever, and that's William Binney. Now, he resigned over the dragnet collection of information that we all have learned about through the Snowden docs, although we were covering it for quite some time here at InfoWars, and there were occasional articles from the mainstream media. But this went all the way back to 2001 that William Binney and others left the NSA. And they left not just because of the unconstitutional illegal collection, although they were very clear about that being unconstitutional. They also said that what the government was doing was actually ineffective. It wasn't as effective as what they were doing constitutionally. In other words, instead of looking for a needle in the haystack, they were trying to take the entire haystack and go through it. And that's what he's been talking about quite a bit, about how the government is storing every single thing, and it's making them actually less effective with the flood of data. But he was also concerned about crony capitalism. And we did a report on crony capitalism. We did a report on the Federal Reserve on Monday, the 100th anniversary of the Federal Reserve. It's called It's a Wonderful Lie. It was based on It's a Wonderful Life, pointing out the similarities between the way the Federal Reserve acts, the way it was created, the methods used to create the Federal Reserve. You know, J.P. Morgan was involved in the 1907 panic, and he was also the arbiter of the bailout that came after that. They used that to establish in the public mind the idea. They manufactured a public panic, and then they manufactured public consent for the Federal Reserve. And so we point that out in the video. We point out several different things about the Federal Reserve. We also talk about religion. We also point out that they saw prayer as a very effective way to approach the problems, that God hates oppression. And so we can confidently pray that God is going to do something to stop it. Evidently, that was something that Paramount didn't like, because every time we linked to the video, they took it down, claiming a copyright violation. However, understand this, the entire video, the full movie, has been up for nearly 2 years on YouTube, has gotten over 700,000 views without any copyright claims made on it by Paramount. But our videos that were political commentary that's protected by fair use were taken down over and over again. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to play the video for you later in the program, and we're going to have William Binney from the NSA, and Alex Jones will be here breaking down a wide range of news. Now, as I said, the government is coming at us with their wish list. And their wish list, of course, at the top of the Obama administration's wish list is always gun control. And so they're coming at us now through the EPA. Because if they can't get something passed through the Congress, then what's the Obama administration's tactic to use this? Well, they'll just do executive orders, or they'll use the various agencies to regulate something as if it were law. And so now the EPA is pushing for gun control by pushing for green ammunition mandates. Now, we reported earlier this year that the last remaining lead smelter was shutting down at the end of the year here in America. If you consider that, we're only going to have lead sources just from recycled batteries and that sort of thing, because we're not going to be allowed to produce lead anymore in this country. Of course, the Chinese will be allowed to produce lead in this country. Remember that about 6 years ago, 2007, the EPA came out and decided that they were going to eliminate all lead that could possibly touch a child. I'm serious. They were going to take out everything, lead in zippers. They were going to put restrictions on people that were reselling used children's clothing. They were going to shut all of that down. They were even going to not allow the resale or the sale of any kind of recreational vehicles that would have lead possibly in some of the engine parts, because, you know, the kid might put his mouth all over the hot engine or something. That was all driven by a child who swallowed a bracelet and died. Now, I don't know how big the bracelet was. They blamed it on the lead poisoning. They said that it was 90% lead, what they had swallowed. The interesting thing is that that bracelet was made in China. China is still going to be allowed to make lead. But we can't have lead in anything. And the tactic that they're taking in terms of coming after ammunition is exactly the thing that is most scary about this to me. Because, you know, if you look back at the assassinations of the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King, they used that to push through the Gun Control Act of 1968, basically putting a lot of restrictions on handguns. Ironically, 2 of the 3 of the people who were killed, according to the official story, by sniper rifles. And of course, they were killed by sniper rifles. Only 1 of the 3 was killed with a handgun. That would be Robert Kennedy. And then they banned handguns. They didn't ban long rifles. But now we see that they're coming after ammunition. And that's quite a bit smarter approach, because your guns don't really do you any good, obviously, if you don't have any ammunition. The Second Amendment is not about having empty rifles. It's about having arms. And part of having arms is having ammunition. Now, at the very beginning of the Obama administration, they stopped recycling brass into the market from the military. That's something that had always been done, and the Obama administration stopped that. And what did that do? What kind of an effect did that have? Well, that was going to raise the price of ammunition quite a bit because there wasn't going to be any used brass coming back in to make bullets. The same thing that will happen with this lead prohibition from the EPA. They went in, had a couple of senators who got very upset about that. They wrote letters. They got that turned around. But we learned at the end of last year that at least one fort in New York is still crushing their brass and selling it very cheaply to the Chinese as scrap rather than selling it back into the market as they are supposed to do, as they've been ordered to do. So the concern is that they're coming after ammunition. It's not just bullets, but they're going after the number of the size of the magazines, and that's happening in Connecticut. We see that people are waiting in line here just before the end of the year. They're waiting in line to register their assault weapons and their quote-unquote high-capacity magazines. And here's what one of the persons said who was waiting in line. He says, if they're trying to make them illegal, I would have a real issue. But if they want to know just where they are, that's fine with me. Well, maybe he ought to talk to our guest that's going to be on in the last hour, William Binney, because out of all the whistleblowers who resigned, and they came after all of them, and they tried to prosecute them with charges, but William Binney was the only one, when they executed a search warrant, they came into his house, he was taking a shower, and they pointed guns in his face while he was in the shower. Now, he's the only one of the NSA whistleblowers who had registered guns, and that's what they did to him. Having a registered gun, having to register your gun is basically taking a fundamental privilege and turning it into a government-granted, a fundamental right and turning it into a government-granted privilege. And that's what they're doing with this. It's a precursor to confiscation. And one of the things that we have to be concerned about with this EPA legislation about ammo is that if we're going to get lead bullets, we're now going to have to import them. And of course, the UN Arms Trade Treaty is all about stopping the importation of arms. And they're going to count bullets as arms as far as importation goes, if that's to their advantage. That's something we really need to watch out. But it's always about the government turning things into privileges. It's always about them gradually infringing upon our rights. One of the stories that really amazed me that came out of Popular Science, and it was kind of a joke story, but it's not really a joke. The USDA issued a livestock permit for magical reindeer to enter the United States. No joke. They actually inserted themselves into the fantasy life of children to get them to understand at an early age that they don't have the right to do anything. Everything is a government-granted privilege. This is absolutely amazing. When you look at the declaration, it says that the reindeer are going to be cleared to come in as long as they get microchips on their ear and so forth and so on. It's absolutely insane that the government would make everything a privilege, that they would actually come in and glorify themselves by saying that we're going to graciously allow these magical reindeers to come in for just a 24-hour period. We're going to let them continue their journey across the country, around the world, spreading holiday cheer as they go. Isn't that nice that the government bureaucrats will move out of the way for Santa's reindeer? And we also have a breaking piece of news here that's on the Drudge Report. The Chinese state media is touting that a new bomber can nuke U.S. bases. This is more of the bellicose chest beating that we're seeing coming out on a regular basis from the Chinese military, the Chinese government. Very concerning for us. Hopefully this is something that is just for internal consumption, but it does look like tensions are building up. We've seen them extending their territorial lines, of course. That's one of the big stories that's happened in the last couple of months, how we've got now overlapping territorial claims between the Japanese, the South Koreans, as well as the North Koreans and the Chinese. They're all claiming these same little islands there. And we see this happening over and over again. We see China saying that that they can reach with nuclear weapons. They already released a map showing that they could reach several cities in the United States with their nuclear bombs. Now they're saying that they've got a bomber that can nuke U.S. military bases, something to be very concerned about. And it's something that, as you've heard before, Joel Skousen believes that our greatest threat from nuclear contaminations is not a nuclear reactor that's going to blow up, although these things are like ticking time bombs. They're getting older and older. Many of them have already lived past their designed useful life, and they just arbitrarily extend the license to them. But he's very concerned that it's essentially going to be a stand-down situation, as he's told Alex, that the U.S. government will stand down, allow the Chinese to do an initial strike, and then use that as justification to enact martial law. They're always looking for some kind of a justification to increase their power. So we're going to be keeping an eye on that. We'll be right back with more news. Stay tuned. Now, we were just talking in the last segment about how the government is using gun control or ammo control to shut down bullets. Actually, it's the EPA that they're trying to put regulations on. This is a common tactic. We have congressmen who, instead of legislating, they give wide open powers to bureaucracies. And these bureaucracies then interpret the law as they see fit. I think in large respect, that was what Nancy Pelosi was talking about when she said, well, we have to pass a law to see what's in it. They do that with the Obamacare law. They did that with the Dodd-Frank bill. They allow these regulatory agencies to put in all of the details. So they just give them these broad, sweeping powers. And then when they do awful things, the congressmen can present themselves as heroes to come back in and roll that back. But they've delegated, they've abdicated, actually, their legislative authority. And that's one of the things that Rand Paul pointed out when he came up with these three reforms that he suggested. One of them is read the bill, write the bill, is what his second reform. And the third reform was one thing at a time. That really kind of hits the main ways that the government, the Congress, has abdicated their responsibility. They put these gigantic bills out there without reading them. They put a whole bunch of different things in it. They usually have a title that has nothing to do with what it is. If it is a title that has something to do with it, it's exactly the opposite. So you have like the Patriot Act, or you have the Affordable Care Act. And of course, the Affordable Care Act is anything but affordable. And you know, there's new Obamacare fees that are coming in 2014. This is an article from the New York Post, and they're pointing out that there's some hidden taxes there that maybe you don't understand. There's a 2% levy that's going to be put on every health care plan. That's something coming out of your pocket. Insurers are going to pay an additional 3.5%. You won't see that on your bill, but of course that will be hidden in the cost. You won't see that as an itemized portion of your bill. But just like Social Security, you may think when you look at your pay stub that you're only getting like a 7.65% hit on your Social Security, but actually your employer is doing a matching portion on that. So you're actually paying like 15.5%. So the bottom line is the government has done this type of trick before. And just like Social Security, they're starting these taxes out at a very low initial rate, at only 2 or 3%. And you're going to see them rise, just like you saw Social Security rise. And you're going to see that only a half, or in this case, less than a half. You're going to see 2% levy on your insurance bill, but then, of course, there's going to be a 3.5% fee that's going to be embedded in the insurance rates that you're not even going to see. And then, of course, there's the 2.3% medical device tax that's also going to go on things like pacemakers and stents and prosthetic limbs. So there's all these multiple taxes that are hidden from your view. And these taxes come on as very small taxes. And they're hiding some of the stuff. Some of the stuff is out there. It's kind of like the very initial income tax. That was only put on the richest people, and it was only about a 1% tax initially. And so a lot of people said, hey, I don't care. That's going to be affecting the other person. Then they found that the rate kept going up, and then it turned into a wage tax. It wasn't just a tax on investment income, which is what it was initially. And so they grow these things. You see this kind of creep that is happening, and that's what we're seeing happening with Obamacare. Of course, Chief Justice Roberts said that it was a tax. Of course, I kind of wonder if he was being blackmailed with that or not after all the information that we've seen coming out about the dragnet collections of the NSA. And of course, he wrote both decisions, the dissenting decision and the decision that the Supreme Court went with. And he did an abrupt 180. And many people at the time suggested that maybe he was being blackmailed with some information there. And we subsequently learned that they got information on the director of the CIA, Petraeus. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that another powerful man would be blackmailed with information. As a matter of fact, that's what makes that kind of information so powerful. And it's one of the reasons that we don't want to give that kind of power to the NSA. They should not have that kind of broad sweeping power. And so we've got William Binney is going to be talking to us at the end of the program in the third hour. Here's some other news, too. If you remember, there was a 60 Minutes story just a couple of weeks ago, and everybody was criticizing them for what a puff piece they had done on General Keith Alexander, and that, of course, was done by John Miller. And everybody was pointing out that John Miller was someone who had worked for the NSA. He had worked for the Defense Department. He had worked for the New York Police Department in public relations. And they were saying he's still doing public relations, and he was. And guess what? It is now official. He is returning to the New York Police Department. He's just changing the label. He's been doing nothing but public relations for the government the entire time. But, of course, the interesting take on that nobody else seemed to get except Paul Joseph Watson, was that he was getting permission, Keith, where a judge held that the dragnet surveillance that the NSA is doing is unconstitutional. I believe that's correct. Now we've had another judge say that this kind of dragnet surveillance, collecting metadata, is lawful. So this is creating a conflict among the courts. It's going to go definitely to the Supreme Court. This judge, Judge Pauley out of New York, said that this blunt tool only works because it collects everything. I think William Binney is going to tell us just the opposite. As a matter of fact, he's been saying just the opposite. He says by collecting everything, they are flooding themselves with data. They're missing important information because they're not following the procedures to go out and get a search warrant and identify who it is that they're going to go for. So when they look at everybody's information, they're not able to really see the important things. So they're missing a lot of important stuff. So it's going to be interesting to hear someone who was the global technical director for the NSA, worked there for over 30 years. It's going to be interesting to see what he thinks and whether or not metadata is somehow different from data. The Constitution didn't say anything about metadata. It didn't give an exclusion to metadata. It said your personal property, your papers. That's what it's about. It's about your information, and metadata is your information, however they want to spin it, whatever kind of semantic games they want to play with it. The metadata is being collected because it's a valuable insight for them. It's a way for them to track you. It's a way for them to track everyone. And so there's a lot of information in that metadata. It's not just trivial stuff. And calling it metadata, which a lot of people don't understand, doesn't change anything. It's just a game that they're playing. So he's going to be breaking that down for us in the third hour. Now, we were talking earlier about the censorship of the report that we did, comparing what happened in Pottersville and It's a Wonderful Life to what happened in the creation of the Fed, because this, of course, was the 100th anniversary of the creation of the Fed on Monday, December the 23rd. And that has been taken down several times. Every time we link to the original one was taken down, and then we linked to some mirrored versions of it that other people had put up. As soon as we would link to it, it would be taken down. And yet there are other fair use commentaries out there about It's a Wonderful Life that have not been taken down. And as a matter of fact, the entire movie has been up for nearly 2 years with over 700,000 views, and yet Paramount keeps filing claims on ours. So what is it that they're concerned about? And what we did was I changed the title from It's a Wonderful Life to It's a Wonderful Lie, because there's just so many lies that are at the heart of this 100th anniversary of the Federal Reserve. You know, the first one is the name itself. It's not federal, and there's no reserves. And so they use that basically as a cover for what they're doing. It's a private organization. One of the things in the movie that I didn't even put in was at one point, Potter's having a meeting with someone. He gets a telephone call, and he says, tell the congressman to wait. Well, you know, congressmen have been waiting on the Federal Reserve. We've been waiting to get an audit of the Federal Reserve. Basically, they tell Ron Paul to just get lost. They're not going to give him any information at all about what they're doing. We're not allowed to see what this private cartel of bankers are doing with our money. We're not allowed to audit them. So that's one of the lies. And, of course, there's the lie that John Maynard Keynes pushed around in Keynesian economics, saying that money that we owe to ourselves as a national debt isn't really a debt. It's not really a problem. You know, people like Keynes, economists like Keynes, are nothing but court jesters for the authoritarian government that wants to use Keynesian economics to write themselves a blank check so they can do anything they want to. But, of course, that money is not money that is owed by the government to the government. That money is owed to the Federal Reserve and to private investors who buy those notes. Every time they print a piece of paper. It's a Federal Reserve note. It's a loan, and they get to charge interest to us. That is the most amazing lie and ripoff of all this, that we should have to pay private individuals every time they print money. Now, that's essentially the same sort of thing that Al Gore tried to get put in with this carbon tax, Al Gore and others. And that is that we should have to pay them every time this group of private investors who are giving out carbon credits, we should have to pay them some kind of an indulgence every time we use energy. And that's something that the globalists have been looking at for quite some time, changing from money to energy as a means of exchange, as a means of controlling the people, as a means of gaining wealth and power. And so we see that reflected. They're trying to get in a global tax because that would allow them, with a carbon tax, to essentially do what the Federal Reserve has done to us with the printing of money, charging us interest on every dollar that they print. And of course, they get to decide what the interest rate is, and they get to decide how many of these dollars they're going to print up. You know, there's also the lie about the money itself. Money is not just a medium of exchange. It's also a way that you store value. Is the value of the money being saved? Is it being stored? You know, in the movie, you look at it and they're throwing around figures that are pretty funny. He's saying that he's making $45 a week. They've got $8,000 that's stolen at the bank that's going to ruin them. Well, those dollars are not the same spending power, of course, in 1947 as they are today. As a matter of fact, look at it this way. Since a dollar, according to the very, very conservative figures of the American government, the dollar has lost 96% of its purchasing power since the Federal Reserve was created through inflation. But to make it a little bit easier to get a handle around it, just think of it in these rough terms. What you could buy with $1 bill in 1913 would take a $20 bill today. What you could buy with a $1 bill in 1947 would take a $10 bill today. And just going back to 1973, you would have to use a $1 bill then had the purchasing power of a $5 bill. So the prices of everything have gone up 5 times, 10 times, 20 times in this 100 years, and that's using the most conservative figures of the Federal Reserve. Most people would say that it's more like 99, or if you compare it to the value of gold, it's like 99.9% of the purchasing power has been lost in this fiat currency that we have. That's a huge, huge tax on working people, on small businessmen, on anybody who's got a job and is trying to save, to accumulate capital, to put things aside for their retirement. Anybody who has a pension plan is devastated by inflation. That's another horrible lie of the Federal Reserve. And then, of course, there's the lie of the bailout. A lot of people have made comments, and it's something that always bothered me too, and that was that the banker in the movie gets away with the $8,000. He never gets turned in by anybody else. The guy that's pushing him around, that's standing behind him all the time in the wheelchair, never blows the whistle on the theft, even though he sees it happening. He knows everything that's going on. Nobody figures this out. There's not a detective that figures this out, and that's the way that things are in life many times. Many times we have to just pick ourselves up and go on and transcend this. And we see that the bankers got away with the giant bailout that happened in 2008. And of course, that was many times the magnitude of the theft that Potter did. And it was many times the magnitude of what J.P. Morgan had to dole out after the panic of 1907. He went to the White House, and of course, you've got this president in who makes his name by saying that he's going to bust all of the monopoly trusts. And yet what he does is he hands over $500 million in today's money. It's $25 million at that time. He hands that over to J.P. Morgan to dole out to the businesses that J.P. Morgan thinks should survive. And of course, the other ones fail. And that's exactly what we saw with the bailout in 2008. We now have the lowest number of savings and loans and banks and credit unions that we've ever had in this country, ever. Since they've been keeping records, we've never had this few number of banks. And that was a key thing in the comparison of the movie because, of course, the monopolist bankers want to drive everybody out of business. It was criticized by J. Edgar Hoover, the movie when it originally came out. He said, well, This has communist overtones in it because they're trying to make the bankers look like evil capitalists. And there was an article that was done on the Daily Mail that came out on Christmas Eve talking about that very thing. But actually, if you stop and think about it, George Bailey was a banker. So it's not about us versus the bankers. It's about bankers who are monopolist capitalists. Of course, Potter wanted to own everything, and that's what we see from the global elite. That's what we see happening in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We see them asserting ownership over everything, and that's the key thing that's happening with this censorship. Understand that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is another way for them to try to enact CISPA, SOPA, ACTA, PIPA, all these different pieces of legislation that were going to be attacking internet freedom, that were going to allow them to shut down your website just like they shut down this video on the mere accusation of somebody. And of course, to get it back is going to be a very long process if you can get it back. And if these copyright bills go through, if you get 3 strikes against you, you are banned from the internet. Just as if you get multiple strikes against you in Google, you're banned from Google if you've got multiple copyright violations that are found there. They will ban you from the internet if they get CISPA through, if they get the Trans-Pacific Partnership through, because they couldn't get these things pushed through in legislation either in Europe or in America. Now they're trying to embed it into a secret trade agreement, just like the Federal Reserve Act was negotiated and created in secret, and many people didn't know what was in it. They're trying to do the same thing with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They're trying to make everything so that they've got total control and so that they assume ownership of everything. Because now in the 21st century, it's not like it was with the banker in It's a Wonderful Life. They're not content with just ownership of everything that's physical. They want ownership of all intellectual property as well. We had an article just this week about how they had asserted intellectual ownership of Silent Night. We've seen the Warner Corporation come back and assert ownership of Happy Birthday, and we see them aggressively push these things through. We see actually even with It's a Wonderful Life, the copyright had expired on it, and the interesting thing about that is that once it passed in the public domain, that was when it became a classic. It was a failure at the box office, but once it passed into the public domain, people saw it, they loved it, they passed it around, it got a lot of airplay, and then the company that had lost their copyright because they didn't reinforce it, they didn't file the paperwork properly, they reasserted their copyright based on the script and said, well, since it was based on the script, we can reinforce that with the entire movie. And of course, when they do this sort of thing, there's nobody on the opposite end that has a big economic interest to oppose them, so they basically go to court unopposed and, I believe, unlawfully asserted that copyright. And of course, they want to extend the copyrights out forever. But that's not what we're seeing here with our video. What we're seeing here with our video is the selective takedown of political commentary on their movie when they allow the entire movie to be to remain on YouTube for 2 years. They take ours down in less than 24 hours. And every time we link to it, it goes down in less than 24 hours. When somebody else mirrors it and we link to it on our website, it goes down within another 24 hours. So we're going to be taking a look at that, and we're going to actually play that for you in the next hour. We've got it at Prison Planet TV. You can watch it there if you're a subscriber. We're probably going to make that available in the next 24 hours or so for everybody to look at it for free there on Prison Planet TV. YouTube, of course, is where we like to go because that's where the eyeballs are. But we have our own site where we archive all of our videos. And if you're a Prison Planet TV subscriber, you can see all of the documentaries that Alex Jones has ever produced are available there for you, as well as all of our special reports, all of our news broadcasts. It's something that you can share with 10 other people simultaneously, can log in and take a look at this. So it's something that you can pass around, and you can use that to wake people up. Now, one of the other aspects I want to talk about with It's a Wonderful Life is when you look at the alternative future, when George Bailey doesn't exist, he gets his wish and he says, I wish I was never born. And he gets to see what it was like if he had never been born, to see what it was like if nobody opposed Potter and he had a monopoly on everything. And we get to look at Pottersville. And this was something that I had never noticed before, and that was the attitude of everybody in Pottersville. When you're looking at Bedford Falls, the real city, there's not all these prohibitions and signs everywhere. When you go to Pottersville, there are prohibitions and signs about everything, everywhere. They've got signs, keep moving, no dogs allowed, no left turn, no parking. It is filled with prohibitions. But of course, the one thing that's not prohibited is vice. And so the place is filled with vice. Why? Because that's an effective control technique for the elite. They take people down morally. It's a form of control. It's a form of slavery. It gives them control over people. It keeps them dumbed down and submissive. That and the fact that nobody owned anything. And that's a clear sign that this is not a movie about communism. In Frank Capra's world, the solution to the Potters of this world, the greedy people who wanted to own everything, like J.P. Morgan, like Al Gore, was to allow everyone to own private property, to allow everyone to be stakeholders. But you're not a stakeholder in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You're not considered to be a stakeholder in Agenda 21. They don't consider you to be somebody who's going to have a stake in the future. You're going to simply be a renter. You're going to simply be a serf. And there's one other thing that was in the movie that I thought was interesting, and that was the way the police acted. You had Bert the cop, who was in the original Bedfordville. He was very, very kind, helpful. He was connected to the community. He knew everybody by name. He's walking a beat. When he comes back into Pottersville, instead of Bedford's Falls, he is now belligerent. And he even takes pot shots at George as he's running away and not a threat to anybody. You know, if you shoot somebody who's fleeing from the scene and is not a threat to you, if you're an individual, that's grounds for murder because now your life is not endangered. It's no different if you're wearing a uniform. It's still murder. And let's take a look, if you guys get that clip that we've got of the police officer who sticks the dog on somebody. We've got a short clip here where a police officer pulls over someone for a traffic violation or for a drug. I don't even know what it was, but basically pulls this person over. It's up on the video right now. Can you play the audio? Can you get the audio on this?
Get out. And then one of the cops, his name is Stafford Brewster,
he's
takes
shoving
the police dog and puts him inside the car along with the person that they were pursuing, Johnny Williams. And the dog proceeds to attack him in the car that he's trapped in.
Unbelievable. He had lacerations all over.
Unbelievable. Yeah, take that down. Yeah, the dog just tore this guy up. So this guy stops. He's pulled by the cops. They've got him, looks like right here in the video, they're ramming his car. So I don't know what the violation was, whether he was running from them. But they stop the car. He's got his hands up. The window is rolled down. This cop goes up and very calmly lifts his dog into the car, and the dog just rips this guy to pieces. And the cop is not getting indicted for anything. He's getting away with that. That's what we see when you've got an out-of-touch global elite who have absolutely nothing but contempt for the people that they're ruling over. That's what we saw in Pottersville. That's where we're living now. We've got the friendly cops who are now taking pot shots at people. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. But we're also going to be joined by William Binney at the end of the show. And there was just a new court ruling that came out today saying that the NSA phone surveillance is lawful. Now, this is a New York federal judge. We just had a judge elsewhere say that it was not lawful, that it was unconstitutional. And so now we have this is probably going to be resolved by the Supreme Court because it's created a conflict amongst the lower courts. And, of course, I'm sure that our rights will be dutifully upheld by the Supreme Court. You remember that when this information came out, when we started looking at things in detail with the Snowden documents earlier this summer, that Chief Justice Roberts briefed the Senate on what the FISA court actually was. And he was surprised, Chief Justice Roberts told the Senate, he was surprised to find out that it was his responsibility to appoint the FISA judges. And that's a big responsibility because, of course, the FISA court is not a court in any sense of the word. And that's exactly what Chief Justice Roberts said. He said he was really surprised to find out about this court because it didn't look anything at all like a court that he was familiar with. It didn't have opposing sides being argued. There was only one side being argued. There was only one judge. There was no jury. And, of course, the decisions were kept classified. Nobody was allowed to see these. And, of course, that is nothing at all like a court. And, of course, he was surprised to see that because courts are defined in the Constitution. We know what a court looks like. We have very clear guidelines and rules in the Constitution. And at that point, Chief Justice Roberts should have said, I'm not participating in this because I took an oath to the Constitution. But he kind of like, oh, yeah, this is interesting, so I'll just play along with this game. And so he appointed judges individually to these courts. These courts, these secretive FISA courts, are pretending that they are modifying the Constitution with their court decisions. Now, I don't even believe that the Supreme Court is able to amend the Constitution with a decision. The Constitution says what the Constitution says, but they're saying that their secretive decisions can amend the Constitution. And he's playing along with that. So I'm not really sure what we're going to see from the Supreme Court when it comes before them, and it looks like it most definitely will, because it's going to be two different courts have said two very contradictory things. Now, this judge in New York is making a pragmatic argument, saying that this is a blunt tool that only works because it collects everything. And William Binney, who was the technical director, the global technical director at the NSA before he resigned over its unconstitutional actions, says exactly the opposite. He says that not only is it against the law, not only is it breaking the law, but it is also ineffective. It's not practical. It's not a pragmatic solution. So I'm anxious to talk to him when he comes back. Now, one of the other things that came out over the holidays, over the Christmas break, was that local courts are now reviving debtor's prison. And this is civil courts are reviving this. So this is debtor's prison if you owe money to the government, if you owe money for tickets, if you owe money for fines that they put on you, they're putting you in debtor's prison. And as I point out, it's just like a Charles Dickens novel, right? It's just we've had Ebenezer Scrooge as both Potter and now also as the local courts are putting people in debtor's prison. And they point out very accurately here that this isn't even cost effective for the municipalities. It doesn't even make sense for them to lock people up. It costs them more than if they'd lost the fine. But it's part of a power trip. And that's what's most important to them, that you live your life as a privilege to them, that they control everything, that they own everything, including all intellectual property. So stay tuned. Right after we come back, we're going to be playing the censored report on the Federal Reserve. It's a wonderful lie. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. The highest-ranking NSA whistleblower, and he's going to have a lot to tell us about this new court decision that just came out today. He was concerned about both the constitutionality and the effectiveness. And, of course, as I pointed out in the last segment, that's what the judge is trying to explain this away with, saying that because it's effective, they're going to collect metadata. Well, you know what? Metadata is your personal data. It's still your personal data. No matter what kind of semantic games they want to play with it, they need to have a search warrant according to the Constitution before they do that. And that's why William Binney and others resigned from the NSA, and they paid a price for that. We're going to talk to him about that. We're going to talk to him about what he thinks about some of the cryptology aspects that are coming out. We've got dark mail that's coming out, and they're trying to encrypt email. I want to ask him what he thinks about the effectiveness of that. He's also had a lot to say about the Utah data center, so we're going to be asking him about that. And, of course, we have a article that's come out that's called on government conspiracies on Business Insider, and they have 9 huge government conspiracies that actually happened. Now, this is an interesting article because one of these is the very first one is one that I didn't know, and that is the U.S. Department of Treasury actually poisoned alcohol during Prohibition, and people died. Now, we know that during alcohol Prohibition, we had a lot of people who were dying because they were making bathtub gin or wood alcohol. They were going blind, and that always happens when you have Prohibition. You get more virulent strains of whatever it is that you're trying to prohibit. We've seen that in the drug prohibition war. The interesting thing, of course, about alcohol prohibition is that we've got 2 constitutional amendments about alcohol prohibition, one that gave them the authority to prohibit alcohol. And you've got to ask yourself, if they needed a constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol, then how can they prohibit everything else today without a constitutional amendment? What changed? Nothing changed except that the Congress no longer has any respect at all for the Constitution. So we've got a constitutional amendment that prohibited alcohol, another one that made it legal, but there was no constitutional amendment that said that you can prohibit everything unless you permit it. And that's what we see happens even with the FDA, even with medical drugs. Everything is prohibited. Alternative treatments can be prohibited unless they say that it's okay. We see that there's constant fear that they're going to do that with vitamins. So they've basically taken it upon themselves to make everything a privilege. Nothing is a right because you're simply a serf. You live your life as they see fit to allow you to do it. But let's go down these other ones that are conspiracies. So they poisoned alcohol during Prohibition. The U.S. Public Health Service also lied about treating black men with syphilis for more than 40 years. That's one that's pretty well known. They also have, number 3, more than 100 million Americans received a polio vaccine contaminated with a potentially cancer-causing virus. Newsflash, they're still putting stuff in the vaccines. We tell you about that virtually every day here. They're still putting thimerosal and mercury and other things in the vaccinations. Number 4, parts of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which led to the U.S. intervention in Vietnam, never happened. There's an excellent documentary that is called The Fog of War, where Robert McNamara confesses that it was a crock, confesses that there was no threat, there was no domino theory. He actually went back to Vietnam and talked to the people there, and they said, we weren't trying to become serfs of the Chinese. We had fought them for thousands of years. Don't you know anything about history? And he talked about it in that documentary. It was an excellent documentary where it really broke down the barriers, and he opened up and made a lot of confessions just before he died. Number 6, the government tested the effects of LSD on unwitting U.S. and Canadian citizens. That's something we know quite a bit about. And, of course, there are people who were scientists for the CIA that died. Ken Olson jumped out of a window, and his family has been trying to get justice for him ever since. Number 7, in 1974, the CIA secretly resurfaced a sunken Soviet submarine with 3 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. There are a lot more of these true conspiracies than are just these 9. But that's an interesting 9 that have come out. And there's a lot of financial conspiracies that are coming out. And right after the break, we're going to have our censored report. So stay tuned. You know, It's a Wonderful Life has been one of my favorite films. It's been a lot of people's favorite films. AFI, the American Film Institute, ranked it as the #1 most inspiring film. Of course, it was the favorite film of director Frank Capra and of the star Jimmy Stewart. It's something that was a very uplifting, very hopeful film. It showed the value of a man, showed the value of a life well lived. It showed the value of helping other people instead of just trying to help yourself to everybody. But it also showed us things about politics, not just things about an individual's life. It also showed us what the Federal Reserve has done in terms of the kinds of tricks that were used to get the Federal Reserve law enacted. And, of course, we ran that report on the 100th anniversary of the Federal Reserve Act being put into legislation. But it was actually, the stage was set for that in 1907 with a bank panic that looked pretty much like the bank panic that you see in the movie that was started by Potter. And people believe that J.P. Morgan was the one behind the 1907 crash, and he used that to not only put himself in power, but he also used it to get around antitrust regulations. He presented himself as the savior. And so we want to go to that clip right now so we can get that to fit in this segment here. This is the report that has been taken down multiple times about It's a Wonderful Life. And reposted on Infowars.com with a new mirrored version of that. So go there and check it out before they take it down, because it's not going to last very long. Of course, they can leave the full movie up for 2 years, but they take it down in just a few minutes every time we put a mirrored version up. So check it out at Infowars.com. We'll be right back. Alex Jones will be joining us in studio. And as that movie points out to us the dangers of monopolies, and as we've seen the danger of having a private group control our entire money supply, take a look at this article from yesterday on Infowars from Kurt Nimmo. Snail nail monopoly forces through a rate increase on Christmas Eve. Yes, a 4.3% rate increase on postal rates took effect on Christmas Eve. As he points out, delivering a lump of coal to magazines, newspapers, and direct mailers, the Postal Regulatory Commission voted for the increase on top of the annual postal rate that is capped by the Consumer Price Index, making this the largest postal hike in more than a decade. And if you look at the chart that he's got there, that's up for people who can see it right now, there's a hockey stick, isn't it? I mean, that's not global warming, because that isn't happening. We've seen that global warming did not reach the phony hockey stick that man created for us, that Al Gore pushed. But there are some real hockey sticks. This is the kind of hockey stick you get with a monopoly. And, of course, all monopolies are government monopolies, because you can't effectively have a monopoly unless the government is being used to keep new people or new competing products off of the market. There's no such thing really as a natural monopoly unless the government helps the person who's doing that. There's another article about the economic situation today that came out from Michael Schneider of Economic Collapse. It's on Infowars.com. The stock market has officially entered crazy town territory. This is something that was predicted by Charles Lindbergh Sr. He was very concerned about, as I mentioned in the report, about how the Federal Reserve could pump up the economy, they could pump up the stock market. That's exactly what we're seeing happening here. And of course, the private Federal Reserve knows when they're going to pump things up. They know when they're going to pull it down. Greenspan lowered interest rates over and over and over again, and then raised them over and over again. A classic pump and dump strategy. But now we see that this is happening on Christmas, day after Christmas, the Dow went up another 122 points to another all-time record high. And he points out that the evaluation of Twitter, a company that's 7 years old and has never made any money, is worth $40.7 billion. And here's some other troubling facts he had. He said the median price-to-earning ratio is at a record all-time high. Margin debt, remember that was the big killer just before the 1929 stock market crash, has reached a level that we have never seen before. And he said during the last full week before Christmas, U.S. store visits were 21% lower than a year earlier. Retail sales were 3.1% lower than a year earlier. As far as mortgages, is anybody taking out new mortgages? Well, there are still some mortgages available with the kind of down payments that we've seen in the past. But of course, with the Dodd-Frank legislation, if you want to do new construction, you need to take out 20% you have to have a down payment of like 20%, or in some cases 30%, but I believe 20% is what they're requiring in most cases to start a new construction home loan. That is strangling the home market. It is shutting down the small lenders. As we pointed out in the report, we've now got the lowest amount of competition for the giant banks than we have ever had since they've been keeping records. So the economic crash and the Dodd-Frank bill, which they both passed and then conveniently took their golden parachutes and bailed out of Washington for private lives and probably consulting positions. I don't know what they're doing. I haven't followed them, but they probably got some nice positions now that the banksters have set up for them. But they did that legislation, and they ran saying that it was going to make everything a lot more responsible. What it has done is it's strangled loan applications for homes for especially the small lenders. And it's increased the amount of paperwork so that many small lenders have just gone out of the home mortgage business because they can't afford to do it effectively. And that's what I meant before when I said there's not going to be any monopolies unless they have the cooperation and the assistance of the government. Because when the government comes in and creates an oppressive amount of paperwork, the largest companies can survive with that. They can bring that into their overhead. But for a small lender, it becomes so oppressive, so expensive that they have to get out of the business. And then he mentions this last thing from the article. He says, most Americans don't realize this, but the U.S. financial system and the overall U.S. economy are now in a much weaker condition than they were the last time we had a major financial crash back in 2008. So we're in an even worse situation than we were when we had the last crash. We're going to be right back after the break. We're going to have Alex Jones joining us here in the studio. He's going to be breaking down a wide range of news, so stay tuned. You don't want to miss this. We'll be right back.
I know you have the big NSA whistleblower coming on, the highest level ever from any of these intelligence agencies to go public and blow the whistle. He's going to be joining us coming up in the next hour. You know, there's so much I could have come on air today and talked about with folks, but the larger issue here is that we are being deindustrialized by design. And there is a takeover that's happening. And the fact is that those of us in the worldwide liberty movement who have accurately gotten past the left-right arguments, gotten past all the black-white arguments, all the gay-straight arguments, all the issues that may have some validity at some point but are meant as football distractions, diversions from the larger issues of a global corporate anti-liberty takeover that's happening right now. And if you look at all the converging lines and all the different developments, 2014 is the most important year ever in modern history and civilization going into the lead up to the singularities that we're seeing in media and culture. I believe there's going to be many smaller singularities or quasi-singularities ahead of what you call the main singularity event, which more and more scientifically is being proven to be real. Doesn't mean it'll ever be a pure singularity, but for all intents and purposes, it will be a singularity. And we are living in just incredibly epic times. There is chemical, biological, radiological, there is frequency pollution. There is so much going on right now. The human species has never been under greater stress. And we can either adapt in a bad way to the stress and give into it and just adapt to dying, adapt to being dumbed down, adapt to being extincted as Homo sapiens sapien, or the thinking human. Or we can use the attacks on us and the awareness of it and that war. We're designed to survive. War against the animals, war against the elements, war against bad people in our own midst. We can tie into all those genetics, those instincts, the spirit God gave us, and actually use this attack like a weight we're lifting to get even stronger. But we have to decide that we have the will to fight in the year 2014. We have to commit and realize that the enemy is going to create infighting, lies, disinformation, to destroy the liberty movement, as Cass Sunstein talked about. They have the Chamber of Commerce and the Republican Party, as I said, coming out full bore. Kurt Nimmo has an article on Infowars.com to destroy the true libertarian elements of the Tea Party that are the only challenge, not meaning they're perfect, but they're not Republican establishment blue bloods. They're not Democratic globalist operatives. They are the only real opposition, and they're popular, and the people know they're the opposition. And it could grow. It could reverse things. We could have victory. Doesn't mean it'll be a total victory. Doesn't mean we'll save the world. But it's one of our best shots politically. Then culturally, we've got to start pulling out of the system and only supporting real media, only supporting local commodities and local institutions. We've got to take over local institutions. And instead of seeing it as a giant, insurmountable work or something we got to do, we have to take joy in that we historically are in a magic moment, a key crossroads, and that we've taken the challenge on the animating contest of liberty. Because the alternative is total dehumanization and enslavement. And so that we're going to take the challenge of all the bad things that are happening. We're going to take the challenge of the globalists coming after us and demonizing us as the fight, and go into this fight cheerfully, and to pray that God literally sanctify us, purify us, lead God and direct us in what we have to do. Because the enemy is good at targeting liberty lovers and good people who have good hearts, who love God and who love justice, saying, well, look, you're not perfect. You did this, you did that. You could have done a better job here. Or, oh, you lied about that. And, of course, lying that we lied. This is how the system, and this happens to people locally who are listening, get persecuted by the spirit of this world. This is how it tries to put us off balance. What matters is our heart's right. We want justice. We want true liberty and equality for all. And we are standing firm on that, moving forward against the New World Order. We know the New World Order is real. It's out in the open now. We've been proven right. We've been proven correct. And so our credibility, not just Infowars.com, not just Alex Jones or Ron Paul or DrudgeReport.com or WorldNet Daily, but the liberty movement as a whole, the John Birch Society, you name it, has been proven to have been dead on. And we always had the documents and the globalist own statements. We knew we were right. It wasn't like we were looking at tea leaves and we're psychic or reading the runes here. We knew history. We knew who the globalists were, what their game plan was, what their philosophy was, and where they said they wanted to take us. Now, it was so fantastical where they wanted to take us that a lot of people would hear us report it, and it sounded crazy, and they wouldn't go look it up. Oh, come on, our government didn't attack its own ships or lie about them being attacked in Gulf of Tonkin to get us into Vietnam, now declassified. Right. Of course, it actually came out at the time. Congress even talked about it. See, our knowledge that was facts to others who were ignorant was rumor, because they don't know what's up or down, the average person. They just believe whoever has the fanciest suit. They believe whoever can speak the best. And people need to start really realizing we're all in grave peril denying what's going on. We're all in grave peril facing this system. But we are in even more peril if we give in to it. And so we didn't ask for this, but we don't have a choice. And now it's very naked what they're doing, ruling by executive fiat. It's very naked how they want to impoverish people. And our main mission is putting out the alternative of liberty, equality, freedom, open, transparent systems, basic common sense that all cultures have followed, which is the opposite of what the establishment is promoting. And the establishment is promoting all this as a selfish act of total domination over the human species in a lust to control and to have power over literally everything. And so this is the great challenge. And I just want everyone to pray for discernment, not just for this show, not just for you, David, or myself or the crew, but for everyone out there who loves goodness, everyone out there who's upset about the culture we see, the degeneration of the economy, the degeneration of the family, the degeneration of our health, the degeneration of our sovereignty, the degeneration of our environment, the degeneration of our future, everything, because we're under siege. And it is our responsibility, it is our duty in 2014, and with this new year coming up, to reaffirm and commit and decide which side we're on, because life will pass us by in an instant. Life will go by so quickly. It's how we lived, what we stood for, what we built, and how we resisted evil. I mean, it's just more and more I realize that this old adage, common sense, is what it's all about. And that we are facing just the incredible decadence and degeneration of society, where we have all the baubles and we have the GMO food and we have the trappings of success, but even that's now receding. Mm-hmm. Whereas the real base liberties and freedoms and honor and culture has been robbed from us, where we no longer have any honor and don't resist oppression and don't resist being treated like slaves. That is, in essence, what slavery is that we do not respond to classical forms of oppression the way we should. And so now we've gotten down into a very, very deep, dark point.
You know, you talked about the left-right division and transcending that and understanding that the bigger issue is liberty. When you were interviewing J. Edward Griffin on Monday, the two of you were talking about the difference, how so many of us who value individual liberty fail to organize and act collectively. And J. Edward Griffin pointed out that acting collectively is not collectivism. Collectivism is when that's forced on you, when you don't have any choices about things. But it's if we work together to achieve individual liberty, and that's a difficult thing for people to see. That's something I think that's very difficult to see, just like it's difficult to see beyond this phony left-right spectrum, to really see that the real issue is liberty versus slavery. We keep seeing over and over again that they keep offering us security in exchange for our liberty, or security,
which is terrorism. They're saying, give up your rights to us, let us rule you, be our slaves, and we'll protect you. Mm-hmm. And that's what a pimp says to the prostitute. I mean, this is the creed of bondage. You're absolutely right. And all the ancient forms of tyranny are now upon us. All the curses of not having a just nation and being a decadent people are now here. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's sad to say that we're going to have to go through this together. The drug-resistant bacteria, the superviruses, but more than that, just the craven degeneration of all that's good. And just a real spirit of evil now that you can see intensifying out there in the people. Mm-hmm. Either people are getting closer to God, closer to justice, closer to being focused on what's important, or they're getting more and more lost in just an ocean of globalist baloney. It is so sad to see the people culturally, politically, spiritually blind and given over to total delusion. And then you see the professionals like nurses and like farmers and auto mechanics and janitors and just people that actually do work and who do have to get a job done. And they're either incredibly grounded like an island of sanity, or you can see in the people's eyes, those that aren't, who bought into television, who bought into the culture. I mean, the brainwaves show it, the studies show it. People's IQs are dropping. They're not communicating with each other. The language is shrinking. Just like Ingsoc in 1984, we see people being turned into beast animals right in front of us, David. It is a...
Well, you know, one of the things that bothers me is this report that we played earlier, where this officer had pulled over somebody. They had stopped the car. The window was down. The guy had his hands up, and he lifts a dog, an attack dog, and puts him into the car, and the dog just mauls this guy. And when you look at this, yes, there is a legal framework that they're creating with arguments and everything to create an infrastructure for tyranny. When we look at the things that are happening with the NSA. And
you look at how they shoot up minivans full of kids.
Yes. But it's a spiritual infrastructure that's being set up with these people. I mean, what kind of person would do that to somebody else when they're no threat to them? I cannot. I look at that video, and it just blows me away.
Well, it's like when we went to the NSA parking lot, and there's the gate and the fence of the NSA, and our reporters walk up because we'd called there before, and they would never return our call. So we're in Salt Lake, outside Salt Lake City, and Anthony Gucciardi and Weldon Henson and Josh Owens walk up very politely in suits and say, "Hi, we're here from the media. We'd like to talk to your public information officer." And they're all freaked out and panic and screech off in cars, and then come back. And then they walk over and say, "I've got an attack dog that if I release it is going to eat you." Literally trying to use fear to terrorize them. And the guys laughed at them, and they didn't know what to do. Then more cops showed up, grabbed their cameras away, didn't even know how to delete the data, and then said, "Get out of here." So they were just totally incompetent in their not even wickedness, just moronicness. And it's the same thing when I went to sent Rob Dew and others to the G20. We had footage of this. We called for days to the Army National Guard that had the big command base with the police. We said, "We'd like to talk to your public information officer about the troops on the street." And so the guys pull up. They have the camera. And they say, "Hi, we'd like to talk to, here's his name." He said, "Come talk to him here." They freak out and say, "Why are you talking to us? It's like, how dare you? You're supposed to be scared of us." And so they never come out. The guys go back to the hotel. The police come, and they put them on the phone with me. This all happened on the radio. I came in that night to a special report because this was happening. This is all on TV. It's on YouTube. And the police captain gets on the phone, and he goes, "Yeah, we're going to arrest him for threatening to blow up the Army base." And I said, "Be careful." I said, "My guys had this all on tape. They were all on the radio when this happened, just because I was doing live coverage and wanted to interview the guy. We're on record. This is a media organization. We're not the general public you're going to be able to arrest and intimidate to waive their rights and say, okay, you won't get 20 years if you admit you were going to blow something up." I said, "You're going to really be part of a national news story here and get in a lot of trouble. You better look into who I am." He goes, "All right, let me call you back." Call me back in about 3 minutes. He goes, yeah, no. Actually, the troops just got scared and thought maybe they had a bomb." And I said, and this cop was, he was actually on the air at one point. I got him on the air, that's right. Was literally ready to frame my crew with the Army for daring to drive up to the National Guard base, where Dew was later arrested days later at the end of the G20, peacefully at the university the day it ended, videotaping kids out there at a demonstration for free speech. The riot police come and we have them knocking girls off bikes, beating them, all this. It was literally wanting to dominate us, wanting to commit crimes against us, wanting to hurt us, and thinking they had the general public. Where if the cops come over to the average person now and say, "You were planning to bomb the Army base," the average person says, "No, please, I promise." And then they end up waiving their rights and, signing on to probation or something. That's like one of our listeners, it was in Fox News a couple years ago, had heard about FEMA camps and Emergency Centers Establishment Act and stuff in Congress. So she went to the base that said they had this area. She walked up, asked about it. They completely freaked out. Arrested her for asking the question. She had an unloaded M4 in her back of her trunk. And it was on the news, school teacher with no criminal record buried in the article, arrested for terrorism. And they said, well, she wasn't planning to attack the base, but still she could have.
Yeah.
And we never followed up what happened to her. I mean, this is the mental illness now where, you see, it's kind of like you demonize your enemy because you want to enslave them. You say, all those black people aren't humans. They've banned slavery in Europe 500 years ago. Germany hadn't yet, but the other countries had. The church says we can't do it. Let's just go to Africa and say they're not human. And it's the same thing. They're just saying we're not human. The government, the corporations, they have just done this now, and now they're just going to basically feed on us politically. And
now that elitism has filtered down to the lower level minions, like the cops on the street, like we saw with this guy who sticks the dog in the car. When you go to the NSA, and even though you're recording this live in your news media organization, they threaten to stick a dog on you. But in this particular case, he's got his camera going in his police car, and he does it right in front of the camera. and nothing happens to him. So that's what I'm saying. We've got this infrastructure that they're trying to create to say that they're allowed to do anything that they want to set up this full spectrum police state. And there's also a spiritual level where they are fine about actually executing the police state because they no longer see the general public as the same level of human as they are. They're somehow subhuman to them, to the people who work for the government. Don't you believe that? I mean, that's what we're seeing over and over again.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's why I just came in today. I'll be back on Sunday, 4 to 6 p.m. live here. It's just that justice and those that love liberty and love God is what it all comes down to, and who just want a future and who want an economy based on free will and free association, not one based on combines, inside groups, and gangs. We're going into that rule of the thug, rule of the gang. There's no doubt.
Yes.
InfoWars is at the tip of the spear. The world knows that now. We're going to come under unprecedented attack. Economic, physical, spiritual, you name it. We need everyone's prayers. I want to thank everyone for praying for my uncle as well, Patriot Biff Hammond. And when we come back in this final segment before your guest comes on, I'll give people an update on that and just some points that I want to make about discovering that indeed it was a drug-resistant bacteria. We'll be right back, but he's still alive.
Legal state and what we have to look forward to in 2014, we got a lot before us, don't we, Alex?
We have to look forward to all these powerful combines above the law with diplomatic and corporate immunity under InfraGard, literally extracting everything out of us. With paramilitary police, and again, not all police are bad, but we know in authoritarian countries they're very bad. They are converting them to classical authoritarian police in front of us. Militarized, black uniforms, kill anyone that asks a question. And it's going to be disastrous because this is not a disarmed population. It's going to get really nasty. And as people fall down in society, it is not going to go well for the minions where the rubber meets the road. So I would advise everyone out there in the system, if you value your future, your livelihood, and any of the due process we've all enjoyed, you better fight for it right now, folks, and you better decide what side you're on right now. And I just got chills when I said that because I feel like I could vomit, David, over how fast everything's moving.
Yes. And
shifting gears, mystery illness has been killing people all over the country. And it keeps people sick for months until it kills them in some cases. And I knew from early cases in the news and family that's died from this that they found that it was a very bad acting staph. And I even have the name. My cousin sent it to me. I was there at the hospital just a few days ago. And this stuff killed my cousin. My uncle was taking care of my cousin. And he is on a ventilator but conscious. Now, you can imagine that's not fun. The doctor basically said they keep him heavily sedated because it's like being waterboarded for 2 weeks. And they're getting him off the drugs, and they're going to try to take him off the ventilator, and they think he may live in the next 2 days. So that big test for my uncle, William Forrest Hammond, is going on right now. And again, I'm not being selfish with my own family. This is affecting everybody. Because I early on said I believe it's going to be a powerful bacteria, and that indeed is what it is. That's what we're getting from areas in the country and the actual local reports. The feds are calling it flu. So what they've they've done this before. They call killer bug outbreaks flu now, and that's a catch-all. And again, I would take the vaccine if it would really protect me from the flu. But the issue is that it's the superbugs, and the flu shot has never protected you from the flu. People don't even know that. They don't even know. They've never guessed the proper mutation, and all it does is lower your immune system in their own studies. So thanks for all the prayers for my uncle. His kidneys had completely failed. They've come back a tiny bit. He was somebody who always said he didn't want to be on dialysis, but they are doing that. But they say because the kidneys may come back. He's turned the corner a bit thanks to the prayers, but he could have a catastrophic plunge at any time. They did look at his organs. He's never been a smoker or a drinker. But he does have classical lesions on the heart and other things associated with Agent Orange that they've seen in other helicopter pilots from Vietnam. So there's that whole thing. But he's a tough guy, and we love him, and we hope he lives.
Well, you're talking about the superbug, and I remember it was just a few weeks ago that there were all these reports about how big pharmaceutical companies were no longer doing any antibiotic research. They were focusing all their money on viruses. They said that the viruses had gotten so resistant to their antibiotics that it was taking them too long to do, and it was too expensive to do this drug research for new antibiotics. So they were just going to.
By the way, of course, I saw that antibiotics don't even go after viruses.
Right. So, but they're just going to focus on
antivirals,
vaccines, because they're not going to. So they're just going to leave us to these new superbugs, and they're not going to do any research. And when I looked at that, I thought, boy, they're really preparing the ground for something they're going to let go. They're really setting the public's.
No, absolutely. There's a lot of false flags, economic, stage terror war, but in my gut, the whole infrastructure is being shut up. And you look at the setup of Homeland Security, they admit this. It's for containing us. And, the cops are going to be dying. Their families are going to be dying. And all that black body armor is not going to protect them.
That's right.
Of course, in the future, they'll have designer medical stuff for the insiders. I mean, this is so devilish, only from the mind of Satan, David.
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight filling in for Alex. We're going to be joined in this hour with William Binney. He's the highest-ranking NSA whistleblower, and he left about 12 years ago when he saw the government violating the Constitution, using crony capitalist military-industrial complex contracts to buy something that was very expensive, that was totally ineffective. And it's very appropriate that we have him on today, because we just had another Supreme Court decision, not a Supreme Court decision, a district court decision, this one in New York, where this federal judge says that it's fine for the NSA to collect metadata, that there's a pragmatic reason that we need to surrender our freedoms. Now, this comes after another federal judge said that it was a gross violation of the Constitution. So it's going to be interesting to talk to Mr. Binney, because he believes that it is not only a gross violation of the Constitution and our individual rights guaranteed by the Constitution, but he also believes that it is ineffective as well. And one of his co-workers that left at the same time, there were several NSA high-ranking officials who left just after September 11th because they realized what was being done at that time. One of his other co-workers, Ed Loomis, said, "After all my struggles with these folks, I just couldn't believe they went 180 degrees against the law." That's exactly what we're seeing. It was not long ago that William Binney said that we are this close, holding his two fingers very close together, this close to a police state. He's now modified that and said that we are in a police state. So we want to talk to him. We want to talk to him about the capabilities that he's known about for quite some time. These are things that people now give credence to after the Snowden documents were leaked, but that he's been talking about for at least 12 years. And then people were talking about this even before the NSA whistleblowers like Mr. Binney went public with it. There were other people who were talking about this, but we've known about this now, and we've been reporting on this for over a decade. But now that the Snowden documents are out there, people believe it. So we're going to ask him what he sees as far as moving forward. We're going to ask him a few things because his specialty is mathematics and cryptography. So I've got a few questions for him about dark mail and some of the other methods that people are using to protect themselves. If they can't get the government to obey the law, then you take matters into your own hand. That's the same thing that we're doing with things like fluoride. We have fluoride filters that we sell people because it's difficult to get the government to stop dumping poison into the water supply. So you can take action yourself. You need to work collectively together to try to get these things done, but you also need to ultimately take these responsibilities for yourself. So we're going to talk to him about the mail issues, and of course with the health issues. If you want to take control of that yourself, we have InfoWarsHealth.com and InfoWarsStore.com where you can find the products. We have still a 10% special on the ProPure water filter. That's code WATER, so you can go there and get a water filter that will filter out not only fluoride, but other things like glyphosate that comes in. That's actually Monsanto's Roundup. That's a present from them. And all these other things that are making their way into the water supply. We have a lot of pharmaceutical drugs, a lot of SSRIs that are persisting in the water supply because the water treatment facilities do not remove those things. So you have to take some control of your life yourself. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk to Mr. Binney in the next, right after we come back after the break, we're going to talk to him about one of the things that he was doing was advocating what's called a two-hop method. And they're trying to extend that. Now, to understand what that is, think about the 6 degrees of separation of Kevin Bacon. You've heard that game, right? And you've seen that. Well, you know, when you do that with Kevin Bacon, they've found, actually, people started playing with this, and they found that you can pretty much relate everybody in Hollywood to Kevin Bacon, not with 6 degrees of separation, but typically with just two. Listen to some of the people that you can, if you just go 2 levels indirect. Take Ben Affleck, for example. He's in one movie called The Town with Rebecca Hall, and then Rebecca Hall is in a movie with Kevin Bacon. So there's a whole list of people that you can go, even people like Charlie Chaplin, they can make a connection to him. Mr. Binney, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Yes. You worked for quite some time with the NSA. You were very high-ranking. You were technical director, global technical director for them. Tell us why you were concerned 12 years ago about what the NSA was doing.
Well, I mean, the basic problem I had with what they were doing was they were pulling in all the data that would reconstruct the social networks of everybody in the United States, whoever used the telephone or sent an email. So that basically was my concern, because that's exactly what the East German Stasi, the KGB, the SS, and all the totalitarian states have done all along. I mean, my primary job there was against the Soviet Union, so yes. I knew exactly what the procedures were that set up that country and how it operated. And this is exactly what we were adopting by doing this.
Yes, you've seen that movie before, and you know how it ends. Now, exactly. we just had a court decision today from a federal judge in New York. This is a Judge Pauley, who has ruled against the judge that said that this was unconstitutional. We just had a district judge say that it was unconstitutional. Now we've got a conflicting ruling. This judge, and I wanted to get you to respond to this, he said, this is a blunt tool talking about metadata, and he says it only works because it collects everything. But you've pointed out just the opposite. You've said that collecting everything is basically flooding the NSA with data so that they can't find real criminals or real terrorists.
Yeah, that's why they failed at detecting the Fort Hood bomber, the Fort Hood shooter, or the Boston bomber, or the New York Times bomber, or the underwear bomber on the airplane. I mean, those whole series of real attacks. What they're good at is getting people to entice them into trying something, and then they arrest them.
Yes,
I mean, that's what they're good at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
instead of really stopping the real terrorists.
That's right. We see that over and over again. We see that the FBI creates a terrorist plot. They pull people in, they supply them, they train them, and then they bust them at the last minute and say, look, we caught somebody.
Exactly. And it had nothing to do with this pulling in. See, the real problem is they call this one program. Well, it's not one program. It's one process. It's the contact chaining process that they talked about on the 60 Minutes program the other day.
Mm-hmm.
That program simply does contact chaining of any data that you feed in. The problem I had was they were feeding U.S. communications with U.S. communicants. In other words, communication like your phone call to your mother or anybody in your family. That's what's building. That's what the Constitution, First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments are all about. Were to guarantee us the right to free association. Well, we don't have that under this program, because this program simply lays out everybody you associate with. And the reverse lookup process is pretty simple. If you want to take a phone number and do a reverse lookup on the web, you can find out who's involved.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a question of just the number. The number really associates you with a name and an address, and it gives you also other kinds of information in the telephone book that you can get fairly easily. So I mean, it's not. This is not simply a number. The Congress is trying to dupe you into thinking that's all it is, and that's not true.
Yeah, it seems to me like they like to try to use they like to use semantics to call it metadata, to say that somehow metadata isn't really your own personal data, that they're really not looking at you very carefully because it's metadata. Most people's eyes just kind of glaze over when they use a technical term like metadata. They don't really understand what it is. But if it had no value, they wouldn't be collecting it, would they?
Well, exactly. But the value isn't for terrorists. It's for the law enforcement. The law enforcement is what's using it. I mean, they're using it to arrest people.
Yes, exactly.
And that's the real issue that I had with them all along.
Yeah.
In fact, we addressed this. Diane Rourke did. She used to be the House Intelligence senior staffer running the NSA account on the House Intelligence Committee, and we had discussed this, what they were doing early on in early 2002, and said if they use this to do that with law enforcement, then all those cases are potentially going to be thrown out in the future when it's discovered that they used this data from NSA to do the original arrest.
And now we
learn
learn.
It wasn't acquired with a warrant.
That's right. And now what they're doing is they're handing this information over to the fusion centers, to the FBI, and they're telling them to go back and saying, well, you're not going to be able to use this information because we obtained it without a search warrant. So go back and recreate this so that you can then use that in court. They're actually instructing them about how to get around the Constitution. You said not too long ago that we are this close, holding your thumb and your forefinger pretty close together. We're this close to a police state. Now you've said we are in a police state.
Yeah, that's because of what they're doing with this data.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're doing what's called a parallel construction, so that they can introduce evidence into the court and use it to convict people. But it's evidence that's constructed after they originally arrest people based on the NSA collected information.
Yes, yes.
And that's the real problem. I mean, we're destroying what we used to have as a constitutional democracy. We're destroying this.
Yeah, let me talk to you about that, too. When you're talking about the dragnet, you were very much concerned about the fact that they were going more than 2 hops out. And when we talk about that, I mentioned just before the break the whole idea of the 6 degrees of separation between different people in Hollywood and Kevin Bacon. A lot of people have seen that game where you take a movie that Kevin Bacon was in with somebody, and then you take a movie that second person was in and you relate it to somebody else. And using that kind of game, they can actually relate Kevin Bacon with just 2 hops. They can take him all the way back to Charlie Chaplin, or they can take him over to Barack Obama. You know, so when they want to go beyond 2 hops, they're essentially saying we want to get everybody, right?
Well, yes. If you just take, for example, if you have 100 people that you call, and each of those in turn has another 100, and then each of those in turn has another 100, then it's 100 times 100 times 100 numbers of nodes you're looking at, or people. That's 1 million. If you go 3 hops.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, so it goes up exponentially.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the point was that it doesn't get meaningful after the second hop. The second hop gives you front companies and things like that. So you can see those front companies that way.
Now, talking about what they store, you have said that you also believe that they're storing everyone's emails as well. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, that's the evidence for that is what Director Mueller of the FBI testified to in the Senate Judiciary Committee on the 30th of March of 2011. He said that he got together with the Department of Defense and put together this technology database where he could go into it and with one query get all past and all future emails as they come in on a person. His response there was he was giving one of the ways they were going to help prevent a future Fort Hood. Well, that means a U.S. person becoming radicalized, committing a terrorist act inside the United States and killing people. So he's talking about the U.S. population and getting the emails on them.
Yes, yes.
The same was true with Tim Clementi when he talked about the phone calls between one of the Tsarnaev brothers and his wife before the bombing in Boston, and how they could get back to that the intelligence community and the FBI have ways to getting back to it. Well, that's because it's recorded. And he also said that no digital data is secure. And the reason, of course, is because they're recording it all. And they're building Bluffdale and storage facilities like that, one more over here at Fort Meade, and the large one down at San Antonio, and other large storage they have around the country to hold all this data.
Yeah, they don't have the capability to necessarily data mine everything right now, but of course they're building that, and if they can keep and store everything, then at some point in the future they're going to be able to retroactively go back. And that creates, I guess, not only civil liberties problems, but it even creates issues in terms of them putting this all together with AI or whatever, fingering the wrong person. I've seen reports where they're looking at somebody with a camera and trying to identify suspicious behavior. And when somebody's like, let's say they're changing their tire, they're kind of lingering around a car and then they disappear. They're down out to the side of the camera. The AI computer is going to identify that as suspicious behavior, might report that as a car theft in progress, and the police show up and start shooting. That's a real concern, isn't it?
Yes, that's basically false positives from bad logic in any automated code they would develop. That's the thing they're going to be facing when they have the White House Big Data Initiative that was issued about 1.5 years ago is actually soliciting private industry to come up with algorithms that would go through large data sets and figure out what was important in that data for people to look at. Mm-hmm. So that's really what they're after, is try to get something that would help them do that. In the meantime, they're left having to do it by hand, having people do it. So that meant that simply means that individuals have to have specific targets to go at, and so they're at least at that point they're still limited to how they can proceed.
You know, we look at this, and you've seen how this ends because, as you pointed out, you were not only a mathematician and a cryptographer, but you also had an area of specialization of Russia. You saw how these totalitarian countries operated. You know how this ends. We know how this ends. Everybody knows how this ends, and yet they continue to offer to us this idea that we can somehow exchange our privacy, exchange our liberty for security. Whoa. Do you see that as an acceptable trade-off? Do you see that as a trade-off? I don't see that as a trade-off.
No, there's no reason to do a trade-off like that. For example, if you listen to General Alexander in his 60 Minutes interview that he did about a week ago, I guess, or a few days ago, where he said he was reflecting back on the 9/11 attack, where the two of the terrorists that came into the West Coast called back to their facility in Yemen, and he said we couldn't tell that the phone call was coming from California. And, you know, my daughter uses the phone system and the terrorists use it, so we have to collect it all and then sort it out later. That's all what I called a false syllogism. I mean, he's arguing that you don't know what the number is when they make the call, and that's simply false.
Hang on, Mr. Binney. We're going to be right back. We've got to take a commercial break. We'll be right back with William Binney, NSA whistleblower. We're going to talk to him about PRISM and about some other issues. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. And Mr. Binney, when you left, you were concerned not just with the unconstitutional spying, but you were also concerned about the fact that they were using a piece of software that was not only not working very well, but fantastically expensive compared to what had already been developed internally at the NSA. Is that correct?
But yes, except that that fantastically expensive piece of hardware never came into being and never really functioned.
So it's kind of vaporware.
Yeah, it was a good PowerPoint.
Yeah, okay. But there's a lot of the military-industrial complex is really kind of driving this, isn't there? I mean, we've had nothing but eternal war since Eisenhower warned us about this. We've had continuous warfare to feed this military-industrial complex. But that's very much a part of this new police state, isn't it?
You bet it is. I mean, what it turned out was after 9/11, some of the management at NSA said that this was a gift to NSA. That meant that their budget would be open-ended. Now they could ask for any amount of money they wanted, and they could begin to have so many contracts and grow and become so much bigger. And that's exactly what's happened. I mean, they've more than doubled their budget, more than almost 3 times. The budget's almost tripled. So they've gotten all that money, and as a result of the contracts that have been let out to all those contractors, which I refer to as bloodsuckers on the different agencies of the government, they basically need to have a problem to continue to justify getting more data. So when they have all these contracts let, they never really want to solve the problem, because once they bulk up and build buildings and add people, they have to sustain it, and they have to get follow-on contracts to keep that going. So that means more and more money. So if you solve the problem, their view is they won't be able to justify more money.
I think
keep the problem going.
I think it's very, very important for people to understand this massive, massive profit motive that these giant corporations have got to keep this thing going. They've had wars all over the world for the last 60 years, and now they've got the ideal profit center, and that is the war on terror, because they can keep morphing whoever the terrorist is. It's a war that will, obviously, by definition, never end. So they can justify an infinite amount of purchases, not only in NSA software, but they can justify it in terms of military vehicles that they're putting in all these small towns, or pulling them out of Iraq and repurposing them.
Absolutely. That's really what this is all about. It's not about protecting us from terrorists. It's about feeding the industrial complex that's grown up, plus supporting law enforcement inside the United States as well as around the world, because they share, the FBI and the Drug Enforcement Agency share this knowledge from NSA with other law enforcement around the world. They simply don't tell them the source of it.
Yes.
And it's the same inside the courts here. I call this a planned, programmed perjury policy. Because it's an organized, structured plan as to how you use data from NSA, and then how you in turn perjure yourself in court by not telling not allowing the defendant discovery on the original information that was used to arrest them.
That's amazing. Now, they play games. They play semantic games when they get this data from third parties. We see them doing this when they go to your internet service provider. They just ask them, and it's like instead of getting a search warrant to search your house, they just go to your neighbor that you've left the keys with and say, we'd like to go into his house. And they say, well, sure, here it is. So they use that legal fiction to get around search warrants, but they use other semantics to do that even internally with the NSA. You've pointed out that they don't consider that the information has been collected until somebody at the NSA actually looks at it. So that means that they could collect that, what we would think of as collecting that information, and pass it on to the FBI and the CIA, and then the NSA would say that information had never been collected.
That's correct. That's exactly right. And everybody's focusing on how the NSA analysts are using this data, when in fact that's one issue. But the more important issue is how the law enforcement's using it.
Yes.
And according to Director Mueller, he can make the query directly into the databases. So
yes,
that's really much more of a concern than what NSA does with it, because they can't send people with guns at you to arrest you and incarcerate you.
Yes, yes. As you were just saying, the FBI director has said that he could basically do was essentially what you would do on the internet as an individual. You would go to Google and search things up. The FBI director says that he has that capability. That's a frightening thing to imagine in a country where we have the highest number of prisoners of any country in the world. People need to think about this. We have more people in prison than communist China did or has. And that's a much, much higher percentage of the population. We're going to continue talking to Mr. Binney. He's graciously consented to come on for the next segment, and we're going to talk to him about what happened to him as a whistleblower. You know, it's been said that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Well, this is a good man who did something, and they came after him, and I want you to hear the story about how he stood up to them and how he is still speaking out. We really appreciate what he's doing. We'll be right back with William Binney. Stay tuned. Mr. Binney, when you resigned as your position at the NSA, you were in a very high position. You were technical director with global responsibilities. And when you resigned and started going through the procedures, what happened?
Well, first of all, I was going to leave there because of all the corruption and fraud and waste internally in NSA. After 9/11, I was thinking about sticking around there and to try to get the bad guys, of course. But then when I found out they were starting to do the spying on everybody in the United States, I felt I had to get out of there because I couldn't be a party to that. I would be an accessory to subverting the Constitution, which, incidentally, in my view, that's what everybody's doing, including that the judge who just ruled that it's lawful.
Yes.
I mean, he isn't ruling that it's constitutional. He's just ruling that it's lawful, and that, you know, he should at least think about what he's ruling there. At any rate,
good point.
That's my view of that. But so I had to get out of there as quickly as I could, and when I did, we were trying to get jobs throughout the community to try to get the right thing done, and also to go to the committees and the inspector generals of different agencies, like the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice. Plus, we attempted to see Chief Justice Rehnquist about that, and in the process, what we did was raise the government knowledge that we were in fact doing this, and which they didn't want to do. They didn't want anybody to know about this. They were trying to keep it secret. That's why because it was all illegal and they all knew it, and that's why the telecoms had to get retroactive immunity for all the crimes they were committing.
Yes, yes. And let me stop you right there. I think that's a large part of what CISPA is about, because they're already spying on people. CISPA is really just about giving them immunity from lawsuits from citizens, right?
Yes,
well, to a large
there's
degree.
A number of lawsuits now against the internet service providers, and they've got to give them retroactive immunity, just like they did telecoms.
Yes. Yes.
If they don't, they're going to be in court with the lawsuit, and that they don't want to happen. So, but it's all been illegal from the beginning. That's why they've been hiding it.
So what happened after you started that now you get their attention, they see that you were complaining about what they're doing, and you're exposing that they're acting unlawfully, unconstitutionally, then what happens?
Well, the FBI, they sent the FBI at us to raid us on the 26th of July of 2007. And the reason they did it then was it was the morning of the second day after Attorney General Gonzalez's testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee on the terrorist surveillance program that the president had. And he only talked about the warrantless wiretapping. He didn't talk about the data mining or the internet or any of the other programs that were running. And they were afraid, since we had a record of going down and talking to committees, they were afraid that we would go down there and tell the Judiciary Committee all of the things that Attorney General Gonzalez never talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And so they didn't want that coming out, principally the program Stellar Wind. That's what the hospital visit was all about with Ashcroft.
Yes.
So that's one of the main reasons they raided us, and they basically wanted to intimidate us and keep us quiet. But in the process after that, they attempted 3 different times to indict us all.
Mm-hmm.
That is all the whistleblowers who signed the DOD-IG complaint back in 2002. That was Ed Loomis, Kirk Wiebe, me, and also Diane Rourke, who used to be the House Intelligence Committee senior staffer with the NSA account.
Mm-hmm.
Tom Drake was an inside man that was going to assist the DOD investigators in their investigation so that he could make sure they got copies of the real data, which they would compare then to the official version that the NSA gave them and see how they were corrupting it or changing it to make it look better for them. So, but as a part of that process, what that really meant to me was here is my government attempting to frame me.
Yes.
Basically. And so, when they did that, fortunately, I was able to pull together the evidence that would show that they were maliciously attempting to prosecute us, which would mean a countercharge against them. They could lose their licenses and be charged with a felony and things like that. So they dropped it all. But that was only because I was able to pull together that evidence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I hadn't done that, I could be in jail now.
And that illustrates the importance of why we don't want to have a police state. I mean, we cannot trust people. That's what the founders of this country said, is that we cannot trust individual men. We need to bind them down with the law, with the Constitution. That has always been the whole purpose of the rule of law. That's why we have search warrants, so that we don't let people have this absolute totalitarian power over others. Now, when they came after you at one point in the raid, tell people what happened when they went to your house.
Well, they about 12 of the agents came in, and they came in with their guns drawn and pushed my son out of the way at gunpoint. I came upstairs. We were just getting up. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. I was taking a shower, and they came in and pointed guns at my wife, and then came into the shower and pointed a gun at me.
Wow.
So, and then the other people they raided, they didn't do that. So why do you think they pointed
guns at you?
They probably figured I knew something, and they wanted to intimidate me into telling them what I knew, which I did, by the way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They asked me to tell them about a crime, and I said, well, okay, here's the crime I know of, and that's that George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Hayden and Tenet conspired to subvert the Constitution and violate any number of laws in the United States, and here's the program they're doing, Stellar Wind, here's the data they're taking in. I explained it all to all these agents on my back porch.
Wow.
Now, the one guy who was the senior on the raid, he was cleared for that program. So he's in the FBI, and he knew what that program was all about. So he's not standing up for his, to defend the Constitution. He's trying to facilitate the cover-up.
Absolutely.
So when I told him that, all he could do was look at the floor. Now, all these other agents didn't know about this program, and now after I told them, they did. And so he had to have a meeting outside my house of all those agents before they scattered to the winds, making sure that they didn't talk about anything that I told them on my back porch.
Yeah, compartmentalization. Well,
exactly.
I'd heard people speculate, I think it was Weirbead speculated that perhaps they drew guns at your house because you had formerly had guns registered to you personally. Do you believe that's the case?
No, because Ed Loomis also had guns registered, and they asked him to go get them, and he went and got them. So he personally brought them into the room with the agents there. So they let him even handle his guns on the raid. So that's just
that's
I
interesting.
don't buy that as a reason at all.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate you standing up. I mean, that's the sort of thing, we talk about sunshine patriots, and there's so many partisan patriots. We see a lot of people now in the Republican side who are now criticizing the NSA, and I'm glad they are. But I hope that doesn't disappear once we get a Republican in office continuing these same programs. We saw Democrats who criticized these programs under George Bush, and now they're giving Obama a pass. Are you seeing that?
Yes, and I've been totally disgusted with. I mean, I've been a registered Republican for almost 50 years, and I am totally disgusted with the Republican Party and what they've been doing or not doing. I mean, this is disgusting. They should be standing up. They're all violating their oath of office, which is to defend, protect, and defend the Constitution, and none of them are doing it.
How do you? What do you see as the solution to this? Where do we go from here? What is the best case scenario that you see working out in this NSA? How do we get control of this again?
Well, I believe we have to elect people who will ensure and make every effort to defend the Constitution against all of these wrongdoings that people have been perpetuating over the last 12 years. I mean, we have to hold these people accountable in court. We can't let them. They have to go to court and explain what they've done and why they did it.
Yes, yes. But we kind of see that as a bipartisan thing. I mean, we just saw that Obama came out and said that these NSA collections were going on under Bush and basically giving him a pass for that, just like he gave him a pass for Gitmo on other issues.
Exactly. He shouldn't be getting a pass for anything. He should be in court.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would assume that you would also think that James Clapper should be in court for lying to Congress.
Well, among other things, sure.
Yeah, among other things, that's one of the least of the things that he's done, right? Is to lie to them. But you know, he was lying about the crime, so it's not just that he gets a pass for lying or that he gets prosecuted for lying, but actually it's the crime. It's like somebody saying that they didn't commit the bank robbery, and really the biggest crime is not the lie about the bank robbery, but the bank robbery itself. Now, we've seen with the Snowden documents that, according to Glenn Greenwald, we've seen about 1% of those coming out, and he says that the most shocking ones have not been revealed yet. What do you think is still in the pipeline to come out?
Well, I don't know. He may be talking about, and I would not. If I were him, I would not do this. If he's talking, I'm not sure what he's talking about. So I'm just guessing here. So he could be simply saying things like they've got all this knowledge of what NSA really does know about everybody in the world, and that may be something he shouldn't release. In other words, it's one thing to talk about programs that are running and the sources of information they're using. It's another thing to talk about how successful they've been at doing that. If that's where you're getting into the information that shouldn't really necessarily be public.
Okay, all right. Let me ask you what you think in terms of, now, you haven't been there for 12 years, and of course Homeland Security wasn't there when you started, when you left. They were just starting to create that, George Bush was. Was it a sense of yours that they were looking at things like laptop cameras when you were there, or that they were storing that? Was that anything that you were involved in, or were you just involved primarily with data analysis?
You mean looking at the...
being able to remotely turn on laptop cameras and things like that. We see a lot of talk about that. And, of course, McAfee has come on and said that was something that was pretty trivial. He did that to the police in Belize. He turned on their laptop cameras himself using software to hack into their computers and to see what they were doing, essentially to spy on them.
Yes, I mean, that technology has been under development or in use for quite some time.
Yeah,
I wouldn't... That's nothing really that new. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, we keep hearing that, and we keep telling people that. But you know, when we'll tell people, been telling people for a long time, and Alex especially, is that, you know, they can watch you on your laptop computer, they can listen to you, they can turn that thing on remotely, and people think we're being paranoid. But I guess you're not really paranoid if they really are watching you. What about cell phones? They were doing that as well with that, right?
Oh yes. Yes, I mean that started with the technology. I mean they've always been. It's like encryption. It's like you improve your encryption process, and others try to counter. It's like defense offense, point counterpoint. You know, it's the way wars have been fought down through the ages. Basically, these are struggles that go on, and just are. You know, that's the way. That's the way it's always been. So I mean, it's nothing really new. I mean, it's something that's been ongoing for quite some time.
That's true. We believe that as well. I just wanted to get your verification as the person at the NSA who was the highest-ranking technical director there. I just wanted to get your verification that yes, they have been looking at this for quite some time. This isn't anything that's new or novel, even though now the press is picking it up as if we just learned this yesterday. Let me ask you about the Utah data center. You've had a lot to say about that. You're concerned, as we all are, about the dragnet collection and about the storage as well.
Yes, because what it is it gets back to what Alexander's argument was. If you can't figure out what it is when you're intercepting it, that is the phone call from the terrorists in California back to Yemen, which, by the way, is absolutely false. That these are machines routing this, and if you don't give it the information to and from, it won't be able to route the communications to a point in the world and then back from it to you. That's how caller ID works. I mean, so I've said evidently Alexander didn't have his caller ID on. You know? So I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's just a false argument. That's what he's hoping on, that everybody will buy into that false argument. So I mean, we shouldn't buy this because it's an absolute. It's just a big lie. All right. Anyway, what was the other question you were? I think I've lost track of that.
Well, I wanted to ask you, since you're a cryptographer, how do you feel? We were talking about laptops, and they're able to hack your laptops, they're able to hack your phone, they can turn them on remotely, they can record you remotely without your knowledge of it. What do you see in terms of, like, email, for example? We've had PGP for quite some time, but it's been very cumbersome to use. Do you even think that was effective?
I don't think anything that's been in any way connected or shown to or shared with the government is in any way safe. I mean, everything seems to be hackable. You know, the Bull Run program set up weaknesses in different systems and things like that. So I don't see any of that that's safe.
So as far as the new program, I think it's Ladar Levinson who had LavaBit, and that was Ed Snowden's email service. And of course, he wasn't encrypting the data as it was being emailed. He was only encrypting it as it was being stored. Now he's trying to come up with something called darkmail, which would make it easier to encrypt it with PGP. That was a very cumbersome process, so he would integrate that and encrypt it from beginning to end. But you still wouldn't trust that as someone who is a cryptologist and a specialist at the NSA.
Well, it's primarily because, that half the problem is actually having the algorithm, and knowing how it operates. Then it becomes a question of getting the keys. So,
got a dog there in the background. That's not a raid, is it? You're okay, right?
I have to let my dog out.
Okay. Just want to make sure you're okay there.
Yeah.
Because we did have a news article earlier on the program where they actually stuck a dog in a guy's car. The police actually came in and just stuck the guard dog in there and just let them attack the guy after he was stopped. So,
really?
Yeah, it's very frightening to see what we've all been talking about, which is a complete infrastructure of tyranny in place, and then see the kind of brutality that we saw in that particular incident. But we've seen it in other things with the police officer or the local campus security guy spraying pepper spray in the faces of people who were sitting on the ground with their hands behind their back. I mean, we see that kind of brutality, and that's the thing that we need to understand, how important this is to get a hold of this and to stop this kind of tyranny infrastructure that you're seeing.
Yes, and that's what I see. That's what I've been seeing from the beginning, only because I had all that experience working the old Soviet Union. I mean, that having that experience made it very clear what a totalitarian state does and how it operates. I mean, it's
yes.
not that hard to figure out.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Binney. We're out of time, and I really appreciate you doing the integrity that you approached this with and the personal price that you paid for it. I know you paid a lot to get this information out to people, to alert people to the criminal actions of the government, and we all owe you a debt of gratitude. Thank you so much for what you've done.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. We'll be right back. Years ago, one of them was Thomas Drake. Now, as William Binney said, they came after him with some malicious prosecution. They essentially, in his words, tried to frame him, and he's absolutely right. They also tried to frame Thomas Drake, and they actually brought charges against Thomas Drake. This is what he has to say about General Keith Alexander. This is Thomas Drake, that they actually did bring charges against him, but of course he was exonerated, and all charges were dropped against him. It was a case of malicious prosecution. But he says about General Keith Alexander, he said he's absolutely obsessed and completely driven to take all information whenever possible. And he says the continuation of Alexander's policies would result in, quote, the complete evisceration of our civil liberties. That's what we're seeing right now. And it was very important to understand what Mr. Binney just said, and that is the real danger of what he sees as someone who has watched this. He was not only a cryptologist and a mathematician, but he also, of course, carefully watched Russia. That's what the NSA used to do. They used to watch other countries. Now they have turned their gaze inward, and they're watching us. And that's where he sees the great danger. That's where he sees the police state, because this information is being turned over to the FBI or to the DEA or to Homeland Security, and they're using that. If you think that they're going to maliciously prosecute whistleblowers who oppose their agenda or who expose their crimes, do you think they might oppose us? Do you think they might oppose people in the press? Yes, of course we've seen that. Of course we've seen that they're going to come after people in the press. Of course they're going to come after bloggers and say, you're not a journalist, you don't have free speech, you don't have the First Amendment. Of course they're going to do that sort of thing. That's exactly what they're going to do. That's why you cannot give up your liberty or your privacy for security. When you give up your liberty, you're going to get slavery. You're not going to get any security. People who are not free are never secure. People who have no privacy are never secure. That's by definition. Now, one of the things that we see happening, and of course, I really appreciate, one of the things I appreciate so much about Mr. Binney is that he said he was a lifelong Republican, and yet he came out against the Bush administration when they were violating the Constitution. And he's consistently stood against this, whether it's Republican or whether it's Democrat. And we've got a lot of, I think, perhaps sunshine partisan patriots now that are screaming loud and longly about Obama, but we'll see at the test of time if they will continue to complain about this once the Republican is in control. And of course, we've got a lot of Republicans like Peter King who just say, or Mike Rogers, they want it hard. They want it fast. They want it deep. They want the police state, and they're doing everything they can to bring that about. So we need to be very, very wise about the choices that we need to make. We need to not be fooled by this left-right spectrum. We need to not be fooled by the Democrats and Republicans. We need to look at what these people stand for and who they stand with. Are they being bought out by the military-industrial complex that is financing this stuff, that's running it? Are they participating in corporate espionage for these American corporations? That's another accusation of the NSA, that they are turning this information over, that they're spying on other countries and other companies, and they're using the NSA to get corporate information, corporate espionage. There's a lot of money involved in this, and we need to be aware of what the motivations of the global elite are. We need to be aware of what's going on with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and these things that are being done in secret as we come up into this new year. And just look at this. They're going to come after not only the Fourth Amendment, they're going to come after the First Amendment, attacking journalists. And, of course, we know that within the end of the year, they're going to come up with things after the Second Amendment. And we see a panic buying going on in California as people are trying to get their long rifles before they have to start turning in their names to the government. That's a very serious thing, that the government has to know everything about you, especially knowing whether or not you got firearms. That puts you in a different category. We're going to follow this story. We'll see you on Monday. Actually, on Sunday, Alex will be here, usual time.